Iran karapte to our Ainu cousins across the Pacific, and aloha from ko Hawaii Pai'aina. My name is Mapuna Hayashi-Simpliciano. I am the co-founder of Ancestral Connections and the Ainu and Ainuic Heritage Education Society. On behalf of these organizations, we would like to thank Japanese American Pilgrimages, or JAP, for partnering with us in this historic 3-part series created by Ainu people and for Ainu people and our allies. It is often said that Ainu are extinct. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need platforms like this to share our own histories and our own narratives, because for too long, non-Ainu have written our histories for us and often wrote us out of history. The history of Ainu existence in the US and other Western regions is complex, as is the history of our relationship with Japan and Russia. Colonial violence in Japan, Russia, and the US have made concerted efforts to erase our cultural and genealogical links to the archipelago that you call Japan and Russia, but that our ancestors called Ainu Moshiri. The experience of Ainu in diaspora is different from that of Ainu in Hokkaido, who we do not intend to speak for, and often includes us having to unpack painful familial stories in order to find our way to reconnect with and revive our cultural ways. Dr. Edwards.
Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Sachi Edwards. I just want to thank Mapuna for that wonderful introduction. And what I'll add is that as you watch today, as you join us and hear these conversations, just please know that it isn't easy for many of us to share these stories, and it can be especially difficult to share about some of the ways that we have experienced racism from the Japanese American community specifically, especially when we know that there are Japanese Americans in the audience. But that said, we trust that you're here with good intentions, and we look forward to talking with you about how we move forward in solidarity. And we also know that because so many Ainu in diaspora feel alone and isolated, that this potentially might reach other Ainu in diaspora who we have not yet connected with. And if so, we'd really like to connect with you. So please reach out. We have a Facebook group that we would love to invite you to, and we can help build relationships that way. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I would now like to invite the other panelists out so that they can introduce themselves to you. I have had such a great time getting to know each and every one of these panelists, and they've quickly become some of my most favorite people in the whole entire world. And so I'm so excited for you to meet them as well.
Shall we cue in? Hello, Aran Karapte. My name is Ed Sheffield. I live in Frederickson, Washington, which is in between Tacoma and Mount Rainier. I'm an IT tech. I work for a medical company, and I'm here to tell our story.
I'm Anna Hasegawa, Anna Sakaizawa Hasegawa. I live in Des Moines, Washington, in a retirement community called Wesley Homes, just south of Seattle. I was incarcerated when I was 14 years old in World War II. And first, after the Assembly Center, we went to Jerome, Arkansas. And when Jerome closed, our family was sent to Amache, Colorado. So if you do the math, today I am 93 years old. I received a scholarship from the Presbyterian Church to attend college in Maryville, Tennessee. And after graduation, I rejoined my family who had relocated to Chicago. I'm a retired teacher. I've taught all the way from nursery school through college.
And I am Ellen Hasegawa Bruning, so I am lucky to be Anna's daughter. I currently live in Seattle and also in Crystal Lake, Illinois. So we have homes in both places. And so I do traveling between the two homes. I am a retired elementary school principal. So and I'm really excited to be here.
And I'll pick up the family, whatever. So I'm Betsy Hasegawa. I use she, her, and hers, and I'm doing that because I'm just rolling into my school introduction. So I serve as Associate Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at South Seattle College, although I am currently living in Lakhtamish Territory, Lummi Nation, Bellingham, Washington, USA. I think the thing that I would say, just in addition, I'm really delighted to be part of this process, and it's just that I'm really enjoying getting to know this group of people as we're doing this. So it's been an important part of my own journey of really reclaiming my Ainu heritage too. So thank you so much. You're on Karate.
Hi, all. My name is Joanne Okika Shigeko Qinaʻau, and it's an honor to be here with you all. I'm from Eva Beach on the island of Oahu. I'm a clinical psychology PhD student and a yoga teacher as well. And I just want to thank Dr. Hayashi-Simpliciano because I wouldn't have known this community existed without her. And so thank you so much for having us.
Thank you all of you for joining us this evening, and we're going to switch to a presentation that Joe did on historical trauma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very special event. I'm honored to have been invited to speak here, and before I begin, I just want to offer some gratitude and thanks to everyone who organized this event, and also to the indigenous people of Hawaii, which is where I am located, to thank the Aina, to thank the land for hosting us. I'm at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and this school was built on indigenous lands. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that before I begin. Okay, so today's talk will be about historical trauma and the Ainu experience. I'm going to try to keep this down to less than 10 minutes. This is not necessarily my area of expertise. It's an area that I've done a lot of reading in. I'm a clinical psychologist. In pursuit of my PhD, I finished my master's last year at Columbia, and all things indigenous are of interest to me. I am Ainu. I am also Native Hawaiian, Kanaka Maoli, and I think it's just so important always, but especially in these times, to help the voices of the underserved and historically oppressed be given more stage, more time, more volume. So it's really an honor to present what I could find here for you today, and hopefully it'll help just give you another lens through which you can think about the experience of being Ainu or being not Ainu, and just learning about the culture. The research I'm going to present is not my own, so I will do my absolute best to describe it in a way that's engaging and accessible, but also true to the researchers who offer it up. So let's go ahead and start. First of all, that's my grandmother. She's the one who is Ainu in the family, and she really only told us that we were Ainu maybe 5 years before she died. Her father was an orphan. He had been abandoned at an orphanage and adopted later by a Japanese family. And he had told her that he was Ainu, and that's why he was abandoned. But she really never talked about it until the end of her life. And you can imagine that there's, a lot of stigma that existed around being Ainu, as I'm sure you've heard other speakers talk about already or will do as this event continues. But that's my beautiful grandma when she was just a young girl, She's passed now, but with us in spirit. So this is what I plan to cover with you today. What is historical trauma? What are some of the impacts we know from the research? Just very broad strokes review. Don't worry, it's not going to get too much into the weeds. We will also talk about some related concepts: adverse childhood experiences, internalized colonialism and racism, resilience and epigenetics, as well as the UN's Declaration on Indigenous Rights. So, historical trauma, what is it? I'll give you just a moment to go ahead and read through this. Right, so it's complex trauma in the sense that it's chronic, it happens over a long course of time, and it happens between victims and perpetrators who have a unique relationship. In this particular instance, we have a colonial relationship, colonizers and the colonized, and it's made more complex in that once the group, in this example, the Ainu, once we're taken over by the Japanese, our livelihoods are in the hands of what would be considered perpetrators. So that's kind of what gives it its complex nature. The term was first kind of used talking about Holocaust survivors. Spitzer, 1973, I believe, was the first to really use the phrase. More recently, however, in the 1990s, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and her colleagues at the Takini Network have really started to explore it in terms of the Native American experience. More recently, we've had researchers here in Hawaii talking about historical trauma in the context of post-colonial experience here on our lands. And I see it as being potentially helpful, a helpful lens through which to view how Ainu have experienced oppression and continue to potentially experience negative outcomes, both psychological and physical. And so this is just a very broad strokes view of what historical trauma might lead to for individuals and communities. We see that poor physical health is pretty common, as well as health disparities. In other words, less access to health care, disparities in terms of the quality of health care. We also see that folks who have experienced high rates of historical trauma tend to also have higher rates of adverse childhood experiences. And I'll get to what ACEs are in just the next slide. But you can imagine that if you have a group of folks who have a loss of language, a loss of identity, a loss of that sense of belonging, that it's creates a lot of stress, right? It creates a lot of heartache. And in family environments, when we have mothers and fathers who have the pressures of providing livelihood and sustenance and nurturance and growth and hopefully thriving for their children, if they're unable to provide that for themselves, much less their children, that creates a lot of toxic stress in the home. And so when we talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, this is how the CDC defines what an adverse childhood experience is. There are several different kinds. And so I'll just give you a second. Go ahead and read through it. You don't need to hear my voice reading through the whole slide. But, you know, we've seen just decades of research on ACEs now. These studies first started coming out from Kaiser Permanente. And if you Google Scholar average childhood experiences, you will find hundreds of studies and meta-analyses and literature reviews talking about how each of these different kinds of adverse childhood experiences can affect us in our adult years. So it does have an intergenerational impact as well as an individual impact from childhood to adulthood. And so this is the CDC's visual conceptualization of how generational embodiment of historical trauma then leads to the social conditions and the local context, like what we were talking about before, sort of inability to provide sustenance, so low SES, for example, right? In difficulty attaining education. You know, when your indigenous language has been made illegal, right? What does that mean for your attainment capacity? How able will you be to provide for your family if you can hardly speak the language of your new colonizers? So finding a job becomes very difficult, right? You see a lot of poverty in indigenous communities who have been displaced, from our friends and cousins on the mainland to Alaska Natives to Ainu over in Japan. And so that then leads to what we were talking about before, the toxic stress in the home, right? That's when maybe the child starts getting the physical abuse or the emotional neglect or even the sexual abuse that comes with the stressors involved in the loss of one's cultural identity. And we know that in Hawaii anyway, in the Native Hawaiian community, we have the highest rates of ACEs, every single one of those, except for sexual trauma. We're the second only to the Caucasian group, and it's not a significant difference. So I don't know what the rates are for Ainu. And that's something that maybe if we do this talk again, I could do a little more research and try to figure that out. But I had a really challenging time getting statistics on that. This, you know, the nature of this presentation is really just to provide you with this kind of a lens and give you some language to talk about what you might be seeing in the Ainu community or what we might be finding as we get more and more researchers out there interested in this topic. I did not add all of the research here. This just very broadly says emotional, cognitive, and behavioral domains are deleteriously affected by adverse childhood experiences. And there's research on sort of neurological mechanisms behind that, issues around self-concept and what that does psychologically. You can imagine what loss of identity and loss of culture could translate to from a psychological and physical health perspective. But it's really beautiful seeing the CDC putting forward this research as well as this visual and positioning adverse childhood experiences as a primary public health concern within the context of historical trauma. That's major. And these are just some related concepts. So there's a growing amount of research around internalized colonialism and internalized racism. Internalized racism is an older term, so there's more research out on it. We know that poor mental and physical health outcomes are very strongly related to internalized racism, as well as anxiety and poor sleep and just a host of very specific symptomologies. Depression in particular was one of the first foci of the researchers who created the term or elaborated on the term internalized colonialism. And they were really looking at the Filipino context and depression and using that as a lens through which they could understand such high rates of depression in the Philippines. So, you know, as Indigenous folks, I'll just speak for myself, I always feel this sort of like tension, dance, sort of interesting dynamic where I want to make known the struggle and make known the issues so that I can leverage funding, for example, to address it. So I can raise awareness and leverage funding to address these issues, right? Which are systemic, but also need to be addressed from the family level, right? From the interpersonal level, from the intrapersonal level. I'm a clinical psychologist, so of course I think a lot about what's going on in the mind and the heart and the spirit of the individual, but it's all interconnected. Now that feels like it's very much at odds with the other side of the story, which is what are our strengths? Where are our resiliencies? What makes us stronger because of these hardships? So we don't want to forget not that there is a positive to colonialism per se, but that there is a strength in having not just survived, but hopefully in some cases thrived beyond the post-colonial oppressive experience. And so I want to pose the question to the audience, what does resilience look like in the Ainu community? I can give an example from another Indigenous community, my Native Hawaiian community. This is a study that was done by Mapuna Antonio, who is one of my mentors here at UH. And these are the 4 kind of categories she found to be most important when she did the sort of needs assessment qualitative part of her study, where she created a measure of Native Hawaiian resilience. And I want to elaborate here on the protective and resilience factors that foster health. Now, I'm not saying that this is what it would look like in the Ainu community as well, but to give you an example from the Native Hawaiian community, these are some of the things that came up within that 4th category. So really a focus on community, on culture, on spirituality, on family, and on land. Aina is land. It is sort of very central to well-being. It's central to purpose. It's central to sustenance. It's central to so much of Native Hawaiian well-being and resilience. And so we find similarities across Indigenous cultures where that connection to land is so key, right? That we are stewards of land, that we are not here to rape and pillage land, to capitalize on it, but to actually, it's a responsibility to nourish and nurture it. And in many communities, land is seen as mother, right? And so as Ainu folks or people learning about Ainu culture, what would you predict if we were to have a study like this looking at Ainu resilience and Ainu well-being? What would be some of the most important things to support and nourish and grow moving forward? Japan is obviously a permanent member on the Security Council, but most of the other members, including Japan, signed on to this UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. And I think that's another interesting lens to utilize when we're thinking about Ainu culture, perhaps Ainu Renaissance, Ainu well-being as we move forward and connect with one another and build visions for what might be best for the community. The UN may not have a lot of teeth in terms of accountability around that Declaration of Human Rights, but that it is there and that countries signed on to it does give some hope. And hopefully we can use that in America and Japan and elsewhere to remind leaders of the international importance placed on Indigenous human rights. So thank you so much for your time and your presence, and hopefully for your reflections. A little on the nose metaphor there. This is a lake from one of my spiritual centers in Canada. It's in ashram where I've done some study and where one of my mentors lives. But hopefully that's given you some food for thought and some comfort of heart. Sometimes being able to put words to experiences can be very empowering and validating. And so I hope some of that came through today. Thank you so much. And yeah, I look forward to speaking with you folks live.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that awesome and very informative presentation. I've never thought about the Ainu and diaspora experience in terms of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences before. Joe and I actually share very similar history, and that our grandparents come from, as well as Dr. Edwards, that our grandparents come from the Hawaii plantation culture. So that's something that definitely, since hearing Joe's presentation, that I am thinking about. So we're going to transition now into our panel. The advantage of having a live stream is that we get to interact with the audience. So as you're hearing us talk and you have any questions, go ahead and type those questions into the chat box and we'll get to them. Dr. Edwards?
Yeah, so the first question I'd like all of our panelists to really speak to is a simple one, and that is, at what point did you learn about your Ainu heritage, and what was that experience like?
Let me start. Hello, I learned kind of around early 1970s. I had started high school and had met my first mixed Japanese American friends. And it brought the question to me, why didn't I look like my Japanese American friends? So I approached my parents and I asked them, why don't I look very Japanese? And my mom, this is the hardest part, started tearing up. And she explained to me that I was, in her words, a Japanese Indian. I had no idea what a Japanese Indian was. And she started telling me stories about how she had been treated when she was a child growing up in Japan. Uh, and it wasn't until around 2013 or 2014 when I was doing internet. Of course, back in the 70s, we didn't have internet. And I Google searched Japanese Indian, and the picture popped up of Ainus, and I connected to the pictures right away. So I understood then why my appearance is the way it is. My grandfather from Hokkaido, near the area of Sapporo, and my grandmother in northern Honshu, near Hokkaido. So I found out my grandfather was Ainu, which of course then made my mother Ainu, and that makes me Ainu. And it was, for me, it was not so much of a, it was more of a experience after I found out what the Ainus were. Up until then, I just knew Japanese Indians and the stories of how my mom felt kind of ostracized as a child, growing up not looking or appearing like other Japanese. And that was the hardest part for me, was when she told me, and she immediately broke into tears and explained to me that this was a family secret and I wasn't to tell anybody. But I did tell my brother because he saw pictures of my grandfather and wondered, hey, grandfather looks like us. And I pointed to my brother and I said, no, we look like grandfather. And so at that time, I still didn't know we were Ainu. I just knew we were Japanese Indians. And I told my brother, mom told me before she passed away that we were Japanese Indians. And he passed away a couple years after that. So he never got to know that he was Ainu. But I did explain it to my nephews that they were both Ainu as well.
Well, in my family, even though my father's mother was Ainu, the subject never came up. And it was actually my children who learned about it. And I'm so grateful that they're interested in exploring it.
Okay, I guess that's the cue for me to talk. So at some point when I was a teen, my grandmother, who was married to my Ainu grandfather, she was not Ainu, she said, come sit down at the table. I have to tell you a deep family secret. And I was a little freaked out about it. And I was like, oh my goodness. So she's like, come close. And she goes, your grandfather was one of the hairy people. And I said, oh, Bachan, I don't know what that means. And she goes, he was a primitive. And I still didn't know what that meant. I was just trying to grapple with what did it mean. And she said, he's Ainu. And I didn't know what that term meant. I didn't know anything about Ainu. So later I asked Mom, I said, Mom, Obachan says that we're Ainu, Oji-chan's Ainu, so we're Ainu. But what does that mean? And and that wasn't anything of my mom's experience either. So it's been simmering, and at some point, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years ago, I talked to some Native friends, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's really common in the Native community, that when there's hidden heritage, like Ed was talking about, it's that for some folks, it's for survival for the younger people, it's like a form of genocide, really, like that we're getting disappeared for our survival and for us to go on without the weight of the prejudice. And so they said, yeah, it's very common that that it will skip a generation, and that an elder will tell one of the younger people about the heritage so it doesn't stay hidden, with the hope that the younger generations will do something with it. So I think that was what happened to me. And so then it's taken us a while to kind of come to terms with that. We're Ainu. It's taken us quite a while, and just what that means, and for it to actually kind of take root and grow in us in a way where we can know it in ourselves, so that we have thousands of years of ancestry, but how do we learn to take in the information that comes in that direction? Yeah. Sisters want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add to that it was very interesting to learn about Ainu people, and that we were Ainu, and it kind of made sense to me because kind of growing up all the time, people would ask, we grew up in the Midwest in the Chicago area, and people would ask us, well, what's your heritage? And I would just say it's Japanese, and they would go like, no, they're not Japanese. You're not all Japanese. And I'm like, yes, I am, and then, so when I did find out that we were Ainu heritage, and I looked at pictures of Ainu people that looked a lot like our grandfather, and that we looked a lot like the women, it made a lot of sense too. So, and so we've been looking for information about it ever since.
Joe, would you like to share?
Sure, yeah. I feel like I've been hearing myself talk for 15 minutes in the video, so I don't want to take up too much space. But yeah, as I mentioned, my grandmother shared that we're Ainu a couple years before she passed. And so similar story, right? There was the secretive part of it, that denial of that part of ourselves, and then a wanting to pass it down before she left this world. And I'm so grateful she did, because it's really brought out this sense of like discovery about identity and ancestral connection, which has been really fulfilling and kind of fun. And my other family members go, oh, neat, and one of my cousins is really interested in it. She's done a little research too. And, everybody identifies in different ways with ethnicity and background and whatnot. But for me, it's been really rich to be able to discover it. So.
Thank you so much for sharing. So, as I stated in the introduction, being Ainu in diaspora is a very different experience than being in Ainu in Hokkaido. And so I would like to toss this question over to Ed, and I'll give everybody else a chance to answer the question. But since you found out that you are Ainu, what does being Ainu in diaspora mean for you specifically? So this is very interesting, right? Because the definition by the Hokkaido Ainu Association, the definition of being Ainu in Hokkaido is somebody who has Ainu in their registry that they can prove for 3 generations back. And Joe and I know that as Kanaka Maoli, very similar system to get, access to Kanaka Maoli benefits, such as Hawaiian homelands or going to Kamehameha schools, right? But it's very problematic for us as Ainu, because many of us, our migration from our ancestors outside of Hokkaido was quite a few generations back. And without that ability to document Ainu ancestry, we often don't have that paper trail. So I just want to throw that out there, right? Legally, and what the policy is now saying, what defines an Ainu, because oftentimes heritage and genealogy is ignored, right, in that conversation. So I'm going to focus on Ed because I know Ed has actually reached out to the Hokkaido Ainu Association, and Ed has been an instrumental part in leadership here in organizing our Ainu and diaspora community. So Ed, what does it mean to you to be an Ainu and diaspora?
Well, for me, my biggest thing was to try to restore some of the culture, because we were removed from it. We don't understand some of the traditions that the Ainus actually practice or are starting to practice again as they start to get back into their own culture. So we're not exposed to the language, we're not exposed to the traditions, we're not exposed to um, their other cultural experiences. They're, even though we may feel some of the same things they do, like our connection to the land, um, we don't know exactly how they go about doing the things that they do. So for me, I wanted to try to kind of restore some of those cultures so that even in diaspora, we can try to practice those cultures as well. So we can reconnect with the Ainu communities in Hokkaido and Japan. So for me, it was instrumental to let's restore the language, let's restore the culture, let's restore all the practices that the Ainu share, and even their modern day experiences. I'd love to be able to experience more of their Ainu experiences in modern day Japan. What's it like to be Ainu was instrumental for me in reaching out and trying to find Mapuana. That's how we found. We connected immediately when we met on Facebook in an Ainu website or on one of the Ainu pages. And then Mapuano, she went a different direction and more the direction where I think we need to go, where we need to start to connect with other Ainu in diaspora, where we need to help connect with the Ainus in Hokkaido and Japan and share some of that cultural experience. Even though we're not connected to them because we're not there, we are connected to them spiritually. We are connected to them because we are Ainu. And we just want to connect better with them.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask that same question to the Hasegawa family. So since finding out that you're Ainu, what does it mean for you to now learn that you're an Ainu in diaspora?
Go ahead. Oh, well, I wanted to first say thank you, Ed, for your comments. For me, what it has meant is looking at my parents' life and having a different understanding of what they have gone through. My father was he fled from Japan as a young man, obviously because of the Ainu stigma. And also the country was becoming more militaristic and he was a pacifist. So, and through a Methodist minister, he was helped to come to America where a family took him over and helped get an education at the University of Southern California, where he became a Methodist minister and actually taught at the seminary there for a couple of years. But all through his life, he has never stayed very long at any one job, even though he was highly educated and capable. And I think now I understand better that it had something to do with the Ainu identity, that when people found out he was Ainu, then the Japanese would, like in a Japanese church even, or a Japanese society of some kind, begin to put pressures on. So he never stayed too long. I think to us, that's the way we interpret it. My mother also was an outsider in that although she was raised in a samurai family as a cultured lady, she was given in marriage, and the mother-in-law was very cruel to her. So my mother left And that, of course, in Japan is a disgrace. So she became a disgraced woman, even though her family was accepting. So when she and my father got together, they were both, in a sense, outcasts from the Japanese. But I think both of my parents then coming to America found an opportunity or a hope for a freer life. But I think I have a whole lot more thinking to do about the meaning of all of this. And I turn it over to my daughters.
We really appreciate your comments, Anna, and we definitely respect you as a huchi or matriarch of our Ainu and diaspora community. We really appreciate you sharing this history. It's so important. And I agree with you. There is so much to learn from our children, right? As they explore this identity. I know I learned so much from my son. So I want to kind of probe Ellen, Carol, and Betsy a little bit. What does this mean to you? What does this identity mean to you?
Ellen, you want to go first? We can just go in the order that Mapuna said.
Sure, I'll be glad to speak to it. You know, it's interesting because so Ed, again, thank you for your comments, because it's so helpful for me to try to get an understanding of what it means to be Ainu. We were very fortunate that we grew up in a community that was it was intentionally diverse, and
It was a co-op.
Yes, it was a co-op. So thank you, Mother, for you and Dad for getting us there. But, you know, we kind of grew up without feeling any societal norms, or not norms, but, you know, a caste system or anything like that. And so I think for us, as we have been exploring what it means to be Ainu, we're very excited by it. And we were very lucky not to have felt within our community, I don't know, that we were less than or anything like that. I would say when we would leave the community we grew up in, and when I say that, going to middle school, going to high school, you know, we certainly faced a lot of the Asian racism, you know, the being called Ching Chong Chinaman, and people, you know, making buck teeth looks at you and telling you, you know, go back where you came from, those type of things. And I, you know, so again, for me growing up in this community, I'd be like, oh, well, I was born in Elmhurst. Am I supposed to go back to Elmhurst, Illinois? I don't understand. So, you know, for us, trying to get a handle, or trying to really learn and embrace our Ainu heritage is an exciting time for us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll go. I remember, I don't know when Betsy, when you started exploring being Ainu, maybe that was in the late 80s, early 90s or something like that. I don't quite remember when that was. And around that time, I was working for a nonprofit organization in Seattle called People of Color Against AIDS Network. And it was a coalition of all these communities of color working to educate the community about AIDS. And so it brought me into not only close working with the Asian community, but also the tribes that were also doing the same kind of work. And I remember talking to some people in the office that I said, do you know what I just found out? I just found out that I'm Ainu, and isn't, you know, and then they're like, oh, well, you're a sister, you know, and it was really wonderful because I felt like I now was a part of two communities, you know, and the Salish community in the Seattle area, all the tribes were, whenever I would mention that I was of Ainu heritage, they were just kind of welcoming of me as if I were a larger part of their community. So it was a really fun feeling and very new for me, particularly since, and I don't mean to be harsh or anything like that, but at that time, being fairly new as a transplant to Seattle from Chicago, it was challenging for me to get to know people and to break into the Japanese community here. It was very, very tight and very closed. And at that time, I was having a little bit of frustrating feeling trying to figure out how I fit into the Japanese American community in Seattle. And whereas with the tribes, I felt very welcome. So that was a new experience for me. And I just kind of felt like I had joined another tribe, another family. So that was really fun. And I enjoy continuing to learn about that. And I will say another thing is in trying to figure out what it is to be Ainu, there was an event in Seattle, and I don't remember what year it was, the early 2004 or something like that, where there was a tribal journey where there's a canoe journeys in the area where many of the tribes have canoes that all kind of converge in an area together, and they're all from the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and Vancouver Island, and they kind of converge and share gifts and stories, and people kind of meet for a whole week-long celebration. And some of these canoes, they paddle, you know, some 300 miles to get to this place. And one of the canoes this year had an Ainu contingency that was hosted by a tribe in the Seattle area. So of course we had to be there because it was our chance to meet real Ainu people, you know, and to like talk to them and see what they're like. And you know, I wanted to see if they looked like me and if they, you know, what it was like. And it was a little frustrating to have a bit of a language barrier. But it was, you know, I kind of was in awe of watching them and present some of their traditional dances and talk about some of their traditional ways. And we as a family went and we just like soaked up every second of being with them. So anyway, and so we're still trying to figure out what it means, but it's still very new to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much to the Hasegawa family for sharing. You know, so the term Ainu and diaspora is something that I wrote about, but really it is a young author named Tara Duffin who came up with the term, who started writing about this term. And so I wrote about it in a more academic way because people just weren't talking about us. I was like, yes, brilliant. That sounds like what our community is. And so that term is a new term for all of us, and we're redefining our Ainu-ness and, you know, reclaiming it for ourselves. And it's so interesting, I find, you know, that Ellen talked about experiencing East Asian racism, but at the same time, you know, Carol talks about trying to move into this hierarchy within the Japanese community. And I heard kind of the same thing from Ed as well about how he, you know, it was disclosed, his Ainu-ness was disclosed to him because he didn't look Japanese. And certainly for myself, that was one of the factors in which my family, how we ended up having that conversation with myself between my dad and my grandfather. So I wanna bring it back to Joe, because Joe and I, interesting, we're raised literally blocks away from each other, never knew each other existed at all until very recently when a friend connected us. But we were literally raised blocks from each other, little itty bitty plantation town. But because of Hawaii's plantation era, we were inundated with Japanese people and the Japanese narrative. Also, you know, what I find is a lot of Ainu and diaspora are mixed with Native Americans, the indigenous people of the land that they've settled on, or in interracial marriages, which for the JA community still to this day is a little bit of a taboo. There's still a little bit of a pedigree going on. And our families tend to have like gravitated towards that a little bit more, I think, possibly because we were excluded. So for Joe, you're somebody that has Ainu heritage as well as Kanaka Maoli heritage, you know, mixed race young woman growing up in Hawaii, melting pot of the world. And then now you're learning that you're in Ainu and diaspora. What does this identity mean for you?
I was so happy to hear it because I was right in the middle of discovering what it meant to be Kanaka, to be Native Hawaiian. Because it was not like we weren't raised to be proud of that necessarily. I'm 41, so growing up, it wasn't, the Renaissance hadn't reached my family. Right now, Native Hawaiians are in sort of a cultural renaissance. People are proud to be Native Hawaiian, but that wasn't really the case when I was growing up. So I've been learning about indigenous ways of knowing and seeing how to care for the land, you know, how much we can offer in terms of climate change strategy, in terms of, you know, acceptance of others and unity. And when I heard about that, I was proud to be able to say, oh, I'm a part of another indigenous group. Even if I don't look super Ainu or even look that Native Hawaiian, I'm very mixed race, total mixed pot like so many other people in Hawaii, but I was very proud to hear about it and I wanted to learn more. I've always kind of grown up the only one in my family with some white blood. So my mom married an Irish Jewish guy. And so I'm kind of used to the sense of like not really totally belonging. That was kind of natural to me growing up. So I try to see things, how I can connect my different ethnicities, you know, what are the unifying factors? And so when I found out about being Ainu, and I'm still learning so much, I was very proud and excited to see the connections between Native Hawaiian culture, Ainu culture, and even the Irish side, and then the unique pieces too, and exploring those. So. Yeah, I am very excited about it. I want to do the one of the genealogy tests too, now that they have all that technology. I know those are out there as well. But yeah, curious. It made me curious.
And we can definitely help you with that if you ever do decide to get that test. In fact, our Ikashi Ed often acts as a mentor. He's acted as a mentor with me to help me go through the haplotypes and genealogy autosomal DNA tests and really decipher what those mean. So we're going to shift it over back to Dr. Edwards with more questions.
Mapuna, actually, if I could just butt in, I just want to say a little bit of about my experience, because it's kind of a little different from what we've talked about so far. So partly for me, it's like I'm coming to terms that this is what it looks like to be Ainu in the diaspora. You know, so it's like however I am is what it is. And you know, I'll say that kind of following up on Carol's story about meeting with the Ainu who pulled with the Tulelips at Canoe Journey, was that Carol and I went and talked to them, and we were like, oh, all excited. Do we look Ainu? And they were like, no, you look fine. And we're like, oh, we want to look Ainu. And they're like, no, you don't. You don't want to look Ainu. And, you know, that's when we started to get a sense of what the internalized colonialism looks like on them and how it's very different for us. And then when Carol went to Hokkaido a few years ago, she brought back the Matampushi. And I realized that because we were a broken link family, we didn't have access to our elders directly. I would have to, if we wanted to reclaim our heritage, we'd have to move towards it we'd have to make a decision to move towards it. So following the lead of a Jewish friend who said, I don't want to pass as a Gentile, a white Gentile. So he was wearing his yarmulke, his kippah, every day to remind himself and to signal to others that he was Jewish. I made a decision to wear the Matampushi every day, even if I didn't feel like it, even knowing that it's probably more like regalia. And in Japan, they probably wouldn't wear it every day. But for me, I do wear it every day, even if I don't feel like it, because it's, to me, it's a celebration. If I can show up and hold my Ainu-ness every day, that's a celebration. It's a cause for celebration for me. So it is both regalia and every day. So every day that I am Ainu, it's a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, you know, some of you, I was planning to ask about your relationship with the Japanese American community, but some of you have already shared about that. But I guess a follow-up question to that would be, what do you think that the Japanese American community can do to be allies, right? Like, some of you have shared that it has been sometimes hard to feel integrated to the Japanese American community. Many of us have stories, myself included, about our grandparents or our elders feeling racism from the Japanese American community specifically, and that's part of the reason why they chose not to tell anyone for such a long time. And so if we, moving forward, are trying to, you know, claim this and embrace it more, what do you think that our, you know, cousins in the Japanese American community can do to make that easier for us living here, you know, coexisting here in the spaces that we are?
It's interesting you mentioned that. For me, my mom pretty much didn't have us integrate much with Japanese American community, so to speak. I thought it was because we were living in the South End, but when you think about it, the military bases here, and there were a lot of Japanese here in the South End. But I think subconsciously she was trying to protect us because my brother and I both look very similar, and neither one of us looked Japanese. And I think she was maybe protecting us from that. But more now is I run into more of the question of what makes you think you're Ainu. I think they need to understand, and education is part of this. They need to understand where our stories come from and the reason why we were almost segregated from the Japanese community because of our appearances. Um, I think biggest thing is for them to understand where we come from, and then, you know, if they can partner with us and work with us towards our goal of trying to find our own culture. And you know, I guess we're still going to get questions about that. You know, because I get that quite often. Is, you know, well, how do you know you're Ainu? Well, it's a traumatic story, as everybody here knows, and the parents told us about it, and it was painful for them to tell us. My mom, I know, came to the United States to get away from that, and it was mentioned she came and left Japan, and so she was ashamed that she was segregated from her. She felt like she was segregated from her family and dishonored the family by moving to America. Well, it turns out later that my aunt Keiko missed her greatly, and when she came to visit. My mom had already passed, so she came to visit the grave. But she wanted me to know that we were still part of the family, and that was really difficult to watch. But again, I think if they just ask us, and because they're inquisitive, that's fine, but don't question us because you don't believe us, because we have traumatic stories behind our histories.
Would anyone else like to share an opinion on that?
Mom, do you want to?
You know, well, I can talk a little bit. You know, so thank you, Mapuna, for sending these, and Sachi for helping us think through some of Anna's history. So I don't know how many people know, but she's 93 years old, but really able to tap into some of her memories, but needs a little prompting. So as we talked a lot about, you know, what has your relationship been with the Japanese American community? Mainly growing up, you said it was because your father was a Methodist minister, and also because he was an administrator and a teacher in Japanese language schools. So their experiences were through my Ainu grandfather, which is kind of interesting. But they did not live in a Japanese American community. I don't know if that was intentional. You know, for my mom, for Anna, I think, you know, she was a kid. She just didn't really know what was going on. So I think our relationship with the Japanese American community has been at best sporadic. You know, so we talk about growing up in York Center Co-op, which was a wonderful place to grow up. And there were a lot of Japanese families. I can't remember, I want to say maybe out of 76 families, there were maybe 10 Japanese families that lived there. But it wasn't like, you know, we all congregated together and did things. We did things with many people. And so I think at best we would say our relationship with the Japanese American community has been very sporadic. So I don't, you know, so when you think about, when you ask the question, well, what can the Japanese American community do? I don't know, Betsy, I think you had a really good response with that. So maybe I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. You know, what I'll say is that that our family's been, so Dad's family was at Tule Lake. And so a lot of our more recent, you know, last 20 years or so, connections have been through activist communities like JA and Nikkei activist communities, particularly Tule Lake Pilgrimage and more recently Suda for Solidarity. And I'll say that we've been, as a family, we've been really well supported. I'm gonna call out Stan Shikuma because he's just been awesome. Like ever since he found out we were Ainu, he sends us all these emails about Ainu stuff. He always brings an Ainu song for us to sing on the bus on the pilgrimage on the way to Tule Lake. So Stan's been incredible, and also Jan Yoshiwara and Mike Ishii, who've been also part of both Suda for all three of them have been part of both Tule Lake Pilgrimage and Suda for Solidarity. So they have all really encouraged us and acted as if, you know, even when we were uncertain and like, oh, are we really, or are we appropriating our own culture and all that, they were like, no, go for it. You have to go for it. You know, and so, you know, I think that certainty, that outside certainty from our community has been so helpful for us, even in the places where we felt a little uncertain and doubt. So I just appreciate that. And I'll also say that Native communities have also been very helpful to me, that some of the elders there have said, okay, you don't have your elders, so we're going to elder you, you know, so that's been really, you know, you're our cousins, we're going to elder you. So it's, you know, so that's been also really helpful to me and us as well. But Ed, I love you, Ed. I just love the way that you're talking and bringing stuff. So it's like I keep forgetting that, you know, it's like because I don't talk right after you. So every time after you talk, I'm like, oh, I love you, Ed. So thank you.
I also wanted to ask a question directly to Anna, if it's okay. And you know, you mentioned at the beginning about your experience with incarceration during World War II. And at the time, you know, you were not aware of your Ainu heritage. And so we also know that this shared experience of incarceration has really sort of solidified a Japanese American identity for many people. And so I wanted to ask, sort of looking back, now that you know that you do have Ainu heritage, does that change how you see the experience of being in the camps?
So we were talking about, has it changed your experience, your thoughts about your experience of being in the camp, finding out your Ainu?
I was a 14-year-old and much more involved in social things. And not that aware of what was going on in the East Say community. There may have been tensions that I was completely unaware of, but I would have to confess that I just wasn't aware.
But I also would say, as we talked about it, so for my grandfather, you know, his mother was Ainu and his father was Japanese. And then for my grandmother, you know, she was raised as a lady. So I'm thinking within the Japanese American community in the incarceration camps, they could maneuver differently. But would it be difficult for my dad, my grandfather, and then his children to identify as being Ainu? I would imagine it would be very difficult, you know, because you're in this, you know, tight community. I mean, literally very tight community. And you're also dealing with not just, you know, a caste system, but also about, you know, loyalty. And so there's so many simmering tensions going on that to add that piece in, I would bet for my grandfather and especially for my grandmother, you know, trying to take care of her children, that would be a very difficult thing to say, hey, by the way, and that would not come up.
Thank you for sharing about that. Mapuna, I believe you have some final questions.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting teary-eyed just hearing that. Yeah. You know, I'll just interject, take off my moderator hat and put on my Ainu hat and just say, because we have a question from the audience that wanted to know, you know, Dr. Edwards and my own experience with being Ainu. And we'll get into more of the question and answers, you know, more towards the end. So please, if you have questions as we're talking, please keep them coming. But I do think for me, I try to make sure that these oral histories are kept alive, because if I don't do that in my own family, right, these identities, these stories will be lost. And so I was very lucky in that I was raised with my grandparents, and I was raised knowing that we were Ainu, but because there was no way around it. I'm heads above other Japanese girls. I'm much thicker than other Japanese girls. Physically, I look different than other Japanese girls. And so there really was no place in the Japanese American community where I felt accepted or where I would be accepted. Often when you look different, you're othered. So I have to say that, you know, this isn't just the experience for Ainu, it's the experience for Ryukyuans as well, and for other ethnic minorities of the Japanese archipelago as well. But my father really embedded in me this pride about being Ainu, but he would do it in stories. And he would tell us stories about our clan, and he would tell me stories about World War II, because he was there. He was there when Hawaii was bombed by the Japanese. And he told me his best friend, and I remember him telling me, you know, an Ainu boy, right? Ainu local boy is what he said, 12 feet in front of him, got shot and killed by a Japanese fighter plane. And so I share this because when we're talking about what can the Japanese American community, how can they be better allies, understand that through Japanese American history, Ainu were there along the way. And so when I hear, you know, Anna share her stories about incarceration, it makes me teary-eyed. And again, just reinforcing that fact that, you know, Ainu have shared in this history with Japanese Americans, but often our presence has been erased, not for ourselves in the way we tell it within our families, but the way, you know, Japanese Americans will then turn around and share this history, right? So we're going to move on. We're going to ask Joe. Obviously, I'm crying. We're going to go back to this historical trauma. So you mentioned land-based activities as important, protective, and resilience factors for mental health. So what does that mean for Ainu who are not in Ainu Moshiri?
Thank you for that question. It's a really good one. And Ed kind of touched on what what I think an important perspective on this could be, which is, you know, it's about the spirit, right? If we're in diaspora and we're not on the physical land of our ancestors, we can be there in spirit and they are with us in spirit. And it's challenging to work on land in general in Honolulu. You know, I'm in this really urban space. It's hard to get access to land, much less your own land that you can work. But that connection can be felt, you know, going anywhere on a hike, going to the park, with your silence and your introspection and your ability to connect to your ancestral spirits. I feel like you can be connected to Ainu land anywhere in the world. That's one way of looking at it. I think Ed really touched on that beautifully too. And if you can make a pilgrimage to go, I mean, that's also a special thing to really physically touch down. And if you cannot, then there are ways to get there spiritually, I believe. And I'm not as familiar with Ainu spiritual practice, but maybe even tapping into some of those kinds of rituals and chanting could be a quicker channel that way. Yeah, if other folks want to speak to that as well, you know, I don't have the answer at all, but that comes to mind for sure.
Very interesting, because I know Ed and I have talked before about this. Ed is a avid fisherman and hunter, carves and tries to do traditional Ainu carving that you might find in Hokkaido. So what does this reconnection of land mean to you, Ed, as an Ainu man, but who is outside of Ainu Moshiri?
You know, honestly, I never really thought much about it. I've always been connected to the land. Being a fisherman and a hunter, I spend a vast majority of my time, even now, I go out in the woods quite often. And now that I know I'm Ainu, I kind of get an idea, you know, they are hunter-gatherers, foragers, and they lived off the land. And I feel a connection with Ainu presence whenever I go out in the woods. I'm always, I'm not a extreme like tree hugger or anything in that term, but I have a lot of respect for the land, and I've always connected closer to the mountains and the streams and rivers than anything else. And that could be because my grandfather was from the area of Sapporo, so I'm not sure. But yeah, I spiritually, I think that's how I connect to the Ainus, is through my connection to the land. And I found out I could carve without ever knowing I could carve. So I somehow think I got some kind of genetic imprinting involved with some of that as well. But yeah, that's how I connect with Ainus, is through that type of thing. My respect for nature, respect for the animals. Whenever I took an animal, even when I was younger, I always praised the animal. To me, the animals, you know, pretty much gave themselves to us so that we could harvest them and survive. And when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of money. My dad was in the army, and part of the way we kept the family fed was through hunting and fishing. So that's how I kind of feel more connected to Ainus via that route.
Thank you for sharing. Anything anybody in the Hasegawa family would like to add?
Yeah, I would. So yeah, thank you, Ed. And I, like you, am very connected to the land as well. Mountains and forest very much, and lately the ocean all the time. And I do foraging as well, mushroom hunt, and hunt plants and so forth as well. And I'm also a healer. I do massage therapy, so I feel kind of do a lot of connecting with my body and with the land as well. And when I did go to Hokkaido a couple of years ago, and it was during the winter time, and the land there, it felt in a way very rugged and similar to how the Pacific Northwest mountains are as you go into some areas in Furano and that area where I was, and also around Sapporo as well. And it felt very familiar to be there, and in the wintertime. And I would like to go back there during other times of the year as well. But especially now that, since I've discovered I'm Ainu, kind of foraging and being in the forest and in the mountains, I kind of have a different sense of comfort to be there, and a deeper connection even. So, and I appreciate that very much.
I think I can share a little bit too. You know, I wasn't really planning on sharing too much because I was supposed to be the moderator, but you know, since somebody asked about my experience as well, you know, I am currently living in the house where my grandparents lived. You know, I lived with here in this house as a child with them as well for several years. And my grandfather, who was the one in my family that has the Ainu heritage, my whole life that I knew him, he was out in the garden, you know, cultivating things, mulching entire trees with just a machete, you know, just like spending his entire day, every day out there, you know. And so now that I'm here, I mean, my grandparents are no longer with us, but I live in this house with my family and my kids. I find a great deal of comfort and sort of spiritual wholeness spending time out there in the backyard, in the garden, you know, doing what he taught me to do when I was young, which I, at the time, like, didn't really understand how important it was. But, you know, for me now, it is quite important. And as Joe said, you know, in Honolulu, I'm really lucky to have a piece of land that I can spend that much time in on a regular basis, you know, and so I don't take that for granted, and I do my best, as difficult and frustrating that it can be sometimes. I do my best to really work on the garden and the trees that my grandfather planted, and you know, to make sure that they survive and thrive. So that's been something that's been really important to me.
We're going to address the audience questions, but before we do, we're going to have one more technical question for Joe about historical trauma, because I think it sets the overtone of some of the answers that we're going to give for the audience question. So, to Joe, do the manifestations of historical trauma evolve over generations? Meaning, there are some that are more prevalent at earlier stages of colonization and others that are more prevalent as colonization becomes more rooted and internalized?
Yeah, you know, I don't know of that many studies that looked at different generations in the same family over time. But I've read bits and pieces about hypotheses about that. And I think that learning so much from hearing all the panelists speak today, you know, it sounds like there's this pattern where there's some shame in a generation, and then maybe there's some migration away from the shame, or some kind of like a movement away from a group, like a family or neighborhood, and then silence about it. And I do know that generally, not for everyone, but generally, if we identify strongly with the trauma and it's central to how we identify ourselves, it can be more difficult to address some of the internalized shame or some of the traumatic or depressive or anxious kind of things that could come out of that experience. So I could see how there'd be some real benefit to maybe hiding it for a generation, like folks were saying, already alluding to here, like give them a chance to like run free without that burden in a sense, and then rediscover that aspect of themselves later. At the same time, what you lose from that is that connection to maybe some of the rituals or the stories. So there's like a give and take, I think, that comes with that silence that everyone kind of spoke to, that pattern over different generations. And in the way that, you know, experience of trauma can be passed down over generations, so can our experience of resilience. So if we have developed tools, like internal tools and coping mechanisms and ways to feed our flourishing, that can be passed down genetically too. The carving that, you know, Ed talked about, you know, maybe an ability to have a little tougher skin when we feel like, you know, things are getting tough. Those things can be passed down too. And so I can't give a definitive answer to that, but that's my guess. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I love how Ed uses the term imprinting. I remind myself of that whenever I want to go and have a nice, you know, nice picnic at the beach, but my boys are right there at the water with my husband, they want to fish. And I'm there left alone, right, with the food. And I remember it. I'm like, oh, come on, you guys, let's have some family time. I remember that Ainu boys, that's what we do. That's what they do. Hunt and fish. It's very much a part of our culture and being Ainu. So that connection with the land is very important. So I love that term imprinting. So we're going to get to some of the audience questions. So Noah Howe asks, has the lack of access or loss of traditional territories affected your experience as Ainu? And so I just kind of want to throw out there right now, it very much impacts the way that we as Ainu in diaspora are able to trace where our homelands are. So Ainu is a very broad term. As Ainu, we have names for ourselves that are broken off into different regions. Some are in Chiu, some are Chupka, some are Kai. It just really depends. There are different ancestries and different historical lineages. And so when we reach out to our cousins in diaspora, they're often going to tell us, what kotan are you from? And that's very hard to answer because for many of us, when our ancestors left Japan, because of the war, there was a lot of geological shifting going on and a lot of loss of paperwork. And so that becomes, even in diaspora, that becomes a very difficult process for us as we are, you know, tracing our heritages back to our homeland and the different regions that we come from. So again, Ainu is actually a very big umbrella term, and there are many different, you know, there's a lot of genetic diversity and even heritage diversity within this term of Ainu. Anybody else want to speak to that?
Well, I think they need to realize, people need to realize too, that the genocide occurred with the Ainus, you know, starting in the 1800s, as far as I know. It probably started before that. But they were, basically, Ainus were prohibited from being Ainu. So a lot of them tried to blend in with and try to be Japanese. I think that was what kind of happened with my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather moved out of Hokkaido, moved into northern Honshu with my grandmother, and they tried to fit in. And because of that, you know, there's a loss of culture, a loss of heritage, a loss of land, and a loss of family ties. I don't know anything about anything past my grandfather. There's no history. Unfortunately for me, my mom passed away in '89 before I actually knew what an Ainu was. So I couldn't question her. So because of that, you know, the fact that they hide that makes it more difficult for us to find more information about our families.
Does anybody want to add anything else to that? Going to the next question, Samo Abdallah asks, have you ever experienced fetishization for being Ainu? as somebody that is helping to be an administrator of our social media page for the Ainu and Inuit Heritage Education Society, I have to say that we have people that want to join because they've seen Ainu on Golden Kamui, or they've seen Ainu in anime. And so if that's the way, because a lot of times we battle erasure, right? We battle people either thinking that we're completely extinct or that we just don't exist at all. And so if you're learning about Ainu and you want to be an ally with us as Diaspora, it's important, I think, to that we're not a costume. And a lot of times I've had people try to join the page or want to interact with our community, but it's as if, this is a culture that they can put on as a costume and take off when they don't want to be Ainu. And so, like Joe's presentation today, one of the reasons that I think we're all kind of going public and talking is because we want people to understand that, being Ainu in Hokkaido is one thing. Being Ainu in diaspora is a whole different genealogy of experiences, historical shame, historical trauma, but that we are now reclaiming and understanding there's nothing wrong with being Ainu. We're very proud of who we are. We're very proud of the resiliency of our ancestors and the fact that this heritage and these stories have been kept alive by our family. So it's nothing that we put on and take off, as a whim. So that's just one of my thoughts. Anybody else have anything that they'd like to say?
One of the things I've experienced, and I know Mapuna, and I know it's been through the Facebook groups, is cultural appropriation. I've had a really few bad run-ins with people who are trying to say they're Ainu because they understand the culture and they practice the culture and know the culture better than I do. I was offended by that because, I couldn't help. I was born Ainu, and I'm seeking the culture. And here's this guy trying to say that he's more Ainu than I am because he studied the culture and he practices the culture. So he's more Ainu than me. It's offensive. So that's another thing we need to look at too, is how often we're belittled because we were separated from it, and yet there's people that think they studied it and that makes them Ainu. That's not how it works. I'm sorry. Our families lived through the trauma of being Ainu, and we live with that trauma as well. And just because we're separated from our culture that we're seeking doesn't make us less Ainu. And I think it's something we need to make sure people are aware of.
Yeah, I want to echo that because I really feel like wherever we are in our journey of reclaiming being Ainu, that's where we are, and that's what Ainu and the diaspora are. So we're going to be all over the place because of what we know and what we don't know, because of all kinds of governments we have no control over, all their policies and stuff. But so I feel like you want to know what Ainu and the diaspora look like here. We're it, and there's many more of us. And people like us who didn't know we were Ainu, as we know, we get to claim it. And thinking about, I guess it sends chills down my back thinking about if my grandmother had not told me, our whole line would not, we would be erased. Ed, if your family had not told you, and it's kind of like, and we have these things in our body, we know things, we have these stories, and they don't make sense until we know this piece. So for us to get to really claim our tribal identity is like huge to me. So I just feel like we're Ainu in the diaspora, and we don't even know what that's going to look like. It's going to change, and it's okay. So anyway, I guess I'm a little defiant because I feel like hey, we're in a process. Let it happen. We're incubating.
I will say one thing is when I was in Hokkaido and I was really eager to meet people that were Ainu there, and I went to a couple of villages Lake Akan was one, and also, oh gosh, I'm spacing out of the other one. But it was an interesting interacting with people because I was eager to learn about my heritage with them. And on one hand, they were curious to meet an American, someone from the United States who said they were Ainu and was interested in learning things. And so there was interest, but also a little bit of suspicion. And I think that being in Ainu villages also, when they're performing and dancing for all of the tourists, you know, that I think that they're very wary about being, and probably tired about being fetishized also because they're performing. And then here I come in here genuinely curious, wanting to know about my heritage. So they were, you know, curious about what I was doing there, for one thing, and the fact that I was telling them I was Ainu and living in Seattle, Washington, and but also very wary of me as well. So so I think they're used to being approached in a certain way and not necessarily having their culture. It's kind of like, in some way, they're treated like they're an exhibit in Disneyland or something like that, and not truly appreciated for a deep culture that they are. So that's what I noticed.
Thank you so much for sharing.
We'll go on to another question. Odie Coyote asks, how important do you think it is for Ainu to foster relationships with neighboring tribal nations and communities? That's a good question.
Well, clearly, I think it's very, very important. I think that because we're in the diaspora, you know, like for us to be connected to people who are connected to the lands that they've been traditionally connected with since time immemorial is huge. So I feel like I learn from Native folks who live on the land and who know who they are, who know who their people are in a way that we don't. And so I think it's hugely important myself.
Well, I think Ainu in Japan seek almost like advice from Native Americans or Samoans or whoever that they're trying to connect to because a lot of the Ainu culture has been lost over the years. And so they're trying to reestablish that connection, and they're using that tie with Native American tribes in the United States, specifically in the Salish tribes here in the Northwest, Canada and Alaska. And recently, I think just a few years ago, they visited Samoa, and then they were learning stuff from the Samoans. Basically, they're trying to reconnect with their own heritage. And so if they're reconnecting, I'm hoping that they understand how we're trying to reconnect as well. So I'm hoping that their reconnection fosters a relationship with the Ainus in Diaspora so that we can also connect with them and share with them as well. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I just want to echo that same sentiment. I think not to keep going back to the Native Hawaiian culture, but you know, we can learn so much from one another and progress we've made. So as an example, in Hawaii, we established these Native Hawaiian preschools, Aha Punana Leo. They were a vital part of the renaissance of the culture, which was endangered. And we learned that from our Maori cousins over in Aotearoa, and you know, they did it first. And to take a hint from them, to see and observe what they've done to revitalize, it was critical to the revitalization of culture here. And so I wonder if there are other lessons to learn on a systemic level too, you know, how to advocate, how to get funding, how to establish a preschool like that, or, you know, we never know. So it's those connections, those special connections to other folks who are like-minded. And I think it can be really powerful.
And I would also like to add, just talking about the Kanaka Maoli Ainu experience, that, in Hawaiian newspapers, right, it talks about, the name for Japanese is Kepani. So in Hawaiian, they really didn't distinguish between Ryukyuan people or people of Ainu heritage. They just used the term Kepani, meaning Japanese nationals, people the boat came from the Japanese archipelago to come here and work as plantation laborers, right? And this is a system that was built and modeled off of American slavery that you see in plantations in the southern parts of the United States, right? And in our families, it was really with the Hawaiian people that a lot of times our families found freedom. So this isn't the case for people of straight Japanese heritage, that when they tried to run from the plantation, the oppression of the plantation, the starvation, people were whipped, there was physical punishment on laborers, they often ran to Kanaka Maoli communities. Our recent ancestors that came here spoke the Hawaiian language because that was the language of this land, right? This was the Hawaiian kingdom, and we had these descendants of these plantation owners that illegally overthrew the Hawaiian government. And so I go into this because, it is my hope that Ainu and diaspora, that we really complicate this conversation about Asian settlerism, Asian settler colonialism. On the continent where, our cousins, Ed and the Hasegawa family are at, they're dealing a lot with Asian hate, right? And so Ainu are absorbed into that because people see us as East Asians. They don't know that we've been oppressed even within this group of East Asians, Japanese Americans. They don't know that, right? So we're under attack with Asian hate. On the other hand, people like Joe and I, we are absorbed into the Japanese American umbrella in the Hawaii context. And often, we benefit from Asian settler colonialism, whether we like it or not. So I think that people like Sachi, Joe, and I, we're really trying to come out and talk about our Ainu experiences to complicate this idea of Asian settlerism, right? That, there are people that might have Aboriginal heritage and have lived under this umbrella term of Japanese. What responsibility then do we have? Because we know it happened to our ancestors. We know that we were displaced from our lands. We know that we were stopped from speaking our ancestral tongue, right? Is that how we want to be in diaspora? What can we learn from that? And what can we teach our Japanese cousins to be better Asian settlers? Okay, I just said a mouthful. So we have Praising Earth. Would love to hear Mapuna and Sachi's story of learning your Ainu heritage. So for me, I was raised knowing that I was Ainu. My grandfather often used the word chupka, and that is more of the northern Hokkaido Kuril region. They'll often use that word. I didn't find that out until recently. So I thought, because my grandparents were also coming from Hawaii plantations, there's a lot of people from the Chugoku region in that went through this migration. My grandparents spoke Chugoku. I never knew the difference between Ainu or Japanese. I just thought it was, it's another thing. And then when my son was born, and just a couple years ago, he's 8 now. When my son was born, I realized that I had a responsibility when he was born to document our Ainu heritage on his birth certificate. For some reason, during that whole pregnancy, I very much felt that my father, who had passed away, I very much felt very anchored to him and wanted my son to know this heritage and this lineage. And so, I was raised with stories of our clan, and stories about the killer whale. And so when my son was born, we live in Hawaii, and in the ocean outside of my home, at the time I lived in Makaha, there was a pod of killer whale that surfaced. And so for me, that was my connection with Kamui, or the spirits, right? What the Ainu call this divine essence. That for me, that was my ancestors calling me back to my lineage. And that was, at that point, nobody could tell me that I wasn't Ainu. Nobody could tell me that my son wasn't going to be Ainu. And we subsequently fought. And my son is the first documented Ainu in the state of Hawaii. And from then on, I wanted to do everything that I could to make sure that Ainu had a platform. I was raised where the elders, the Japanese elders, would talk story. We'd go everywhere with my grandparents, and we could be in front of a supermarket, and he would see somebody else. They would talk about the boys that were interned, or the boys that died at war, or just, their histories together, playing golf. And they would point out, my grandfather would point out who was Ainu and who wasn't to me. But as I grew up, like I said, Joe and I were in the same town. Everybody was just under this umbrella term of being Japanese, or being Asian, or being Filipino, or being Hawaiian, or just being local. So it all became, very mixed up, right? So I wanted to make sure in recent years, having had that experience where I felt inside me, my truth was, you know what? I knew I'm connecting with my ancestors. I want to make sure that my children have this chance to connect with their ancestors. For me, it was important to document these stories, and that kind of drives the work that I do today.
For me, I didn't learn until after my grandfather passed, and it was actually after both of my grandparents passed, and it was because my mom disclosed to me that my grandmother, who was Japanese, used to say, she used to say all the time that he was Ainu, and as if it was sort of like a bad thing or something to be ashamed about. And learning that sort of made a lot of other things click. That he used to tell me, he used to tell me all the time how racist Japanese people were. And I never really understood why he was saying that to me. So I was like, you're Japanese, Grandpa, what are you talking about? And he never really, I grew up in Hawaii, and I grew up feeling like I was Japanese in Hawaii, but I never actually felt like I was super integrated with the Japanese community. And again, that's like, okay, well, maybe that was part of it, yeah, so I mean, I still feel like I'm at a very early point in my journey to understand what that means for me. I, like Ed, I'm struggling to find information about my grandfather or my great-grandparent, anything before my great-grandparents. My great-grandparents were the ones that came to Hawaii to work on the plantations. And yeah, so for me, I'm still on that path, but as Betsy said, this is the experience of those of us who are in diaspora, and it's different from the experience of being Ainu in Hokkaido, and we're, I'm certainly not trying to claim that I have that experience, because I don't, but that's what this experience is, that it's confusion and it's sadness over someone that we love so deeply, and now finding out that there's a whole side of them that we didn't really know, and how can we know them better, and how can we honor their lives and what they were not able to be when they were alive. Now that we know, what responsibility do we have? Yeah, so that's the quick summary of my experience.
Appreciate you sharing. That's a treat for us. We just thought we'd be quiet moderators.
Yeah.
So Thomas M. Kurihara I'm going to assume with the passing of Issei, Kibei, and Elder Nisei, the attitudes towards Ainu may have changed. Any observations? I'm just going to say this is just social media. Social media can bring out the worst in people. I've had people in Japanese American chat rooms tell me I'm not Japanese. I'm not Nikkei. I don't have Japanese blood enough to be Nikkei. I've had people tell me Ainu are extinct. I've had people tell me that Ainu are mixed race anyway, practically Japanese anyway. Stop saying I'm Ainu. I mean, these are people that don't even know me in these chat rooms. So I'm kind of going to go out on the limb and say, yes, I think that there are the people that are open-minded and that they're excited to learn about their Ainu, or they have Ainu heritage in their family, or they accept diversity. But I still think that there are some voices within the Japanese American community that have this idea in their head about what being Japanese is. And so one of the reasons why we want to have these conversations, or at least I do, is to recognize that Japan is actually a very diverse place. It has a deep, deep, deep Aboriginal history. Our people always were and always will be. And there are many distinct ethnicities in Japan, even today.
Every once in a while I'll have students who, Japanese nationals, like students from Japan, come up to me and they'll see me wearing the matampushi and they'll be like, "Oh my God," I mean, well, not like that because they don't speak that way, but it'll be like, "Wow, are you?" And when they find out I'm Ainu, they're like, "I didn't know there were still any Ainu alive." I thought that I thought they were extinct, like you were saying, and it's like, wow, you're the first Ainu person I've ever met. And, and there's a part of me that likes that. And there's a part of me that's really sad. But I like to get to talk about being Ainu, so, even the people that go, "Oh, cool headband," it's like I get to talk about, well, actually.
I think another thing that is important to note about, current observations about Ainu is that we also, as Ed sort of alluded to earlier, there's a great deal of appropriation that goes on, and there's a desire among some folks to claim Indigenous knowledge that they don't necessarily have. And so we feel like we have to we have to be very careful and thoughtful and intentional about the way that we go about attempting to reclaim our Ainu heritage, because we don't want to claim that we have access to all of the same experiences and knowledge that the Ainu in Hokkaido do. And we don't want to, in being Ainu ourselves and into finding our Ainu-ness, we don't want to sort of speak over the Ainu in Hokkaido, right? And so I know that there have been experiences within the group where we have had to kind of call out some folks for sort of stepping over boundaries in a certain way. And so I think that there are still, as Mapuna said, there are still sort of negative or ignorant attitudes about Ainu people. But then there are also some like overzealous folks who really cross the line of appropriation in a way that's harmful to Ainu in Hokkaido, and we certainly don't want to do that.
I just kind of have to share a feeling of the whole confusion that we all feel in trying to reclaim being Ainu. I have a matambushi that I brought with me intending to put it on for this presentation. And I put it on, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I felt like an imposter, you know what I mean? And I was like, oh, wait, I shouldn't wear this. And I decided not to wear it. But now I'm kind of like, I should wear it, you know? You know, but that's the whole confusion about, like, I'm Ainu, but, you know, trying to figure out about what it's like to claim being Ainu, and does it feel okay, or does it feel, and at some point, it does feel a little bit scary to step out and claim it, you know, visibly, like the way my sister Betsy's doing, or the way that Dr. Hayashi is doing it too with her tattoo as well. So, so anyway, it's part of what it's like being the diaspora, right? Is that we're out here just trying to figure it out.
Thank you so much, Carol, for sharing that, and that, you know, being very, very transparent. And again, these are some of the complexities of being diaspora. And, you know, I would even go as far as to liken it to, you know, when an African American meet somebody that is born in Nigeria or born in Senegal, right? There's things that have been passed on through the generations, like how Ed said, that we have this imprinting or these stories and these things that we've inherited, but there are definitely things of the culture that we just have not, we have not been exposed to. And so that's always that challenge of being diaspora. So I appreciate you sharing that, Carol. And I just want to share a quick story of one of the reasons why I wear, in our dialect, we call it the Anchipiri. In Hokkaido Ainu, they'll call it a sinue. One of the reasons that I wear it is because, and it's so funny that you share that, because today it's like, I took it on, I put it on, I took it off, I put it on, took it off. But I decided to wear it because I want to normalize this. So in 2016, I actually work in Hawaiian language, cultural restoration. And we had the governor of Hokkaido and several Ainu teenagers come down to the location where I work to absorb us, kind of like what Joe was talking about, to observe what they could learn to take back to Hokkaido. And one of the students that was there, I decided to wear my anchipiri that day, and one of the dignitaries from Hokkaido actually told me, "Are you wearing a Halloween costume?" And then I responded to him and I said, "No, this is my ancestors reminding you that we're still here," right? One of the students that day is actually working very hard right now to perpetuate Ainu language and culture. And I recognized, talking with her and her family, that it was important for me, for them to see me as an Ainu woman with an anchipiri on in a position of leadership. And so for I've had to recognize for myself, it's super hard, but I don't necessarily do this for me. I do this to normalize it for others. But I do feel good. I'll be honest with you. This is where I feel the most beautiful. This is where I feel the most connected with my ancestors. And so, and on some sense, I do it for, it is selfish in that it brings me spiritual wholeness when I do wear my anchipiri, but I do it for the reason of normalizing this, right? I want people to not look at this and go, "Ooh, that's ugly," or "Ooh, that's off-putting." I want to normalize it so people understand this is a part of who we are as Ainu women. And unfortunately, I do paint this on, and I put it on and I can take it off. But because the process of tattooing was annihilated in Japan, right? It's illegal in Japan. I think maybe even just like months ago, they just made it so it's to have a tattoo is not illegal. Somebody has to do some research on that, but it's definitely something that is looked at through the Japanese lens as being taboo. That comes from this history of anti-Aboriginality that the Japanese had in looking at Ainu women, right? And so I try to just, even though sometimes I struggle just as Carol does or just as Betsy does, right? Should I not? For me, I want my sons to see this and for it to be normal for them. And so that's one of the reasons why ultimately I do it. I'm just going to quickly run through some questions. So Samo Abdallah asks, do you think about Japan profiting off of Ainu culture? On our third show on May 21st, we're going to be addressing that with Ainu in Hokkaido. So save that question for then. You can actually ask Ainu activists who are born and raised living in Hokkaido right now. And same person asks, will we be doing more events? And suggest doing maybe a historical trivia night. And so we will be doing more events. So next week, we're going to be getting into a whole other panel of Ainu artists. And after that, the following Friday, we're going to be doing another panel talking to Ainu activists in Hokkaido. Yeah. So with that, does anybody have anything else that they'd like to add?
I just want to thank especially Anna for sharing your story and for hanging in with us for this time. I just really appreciate hearing from you and everybody else as well.
Thank you so much. We're approaching 2 hours right now. So again, I would like to thank the JAMP community for having us here and allowing us to use this platform to share our stories. Thank you to each of our panelists, and especially Dr. Edwards, for sharing your stories and taking your time out to be with us this evening. So I bid you all a farewell, and I hope that you will tune in next Friday as we talk about Ainu artists in diaspora.